facings. Now on this sample, we're going to have 1/2 inch of seam allowance and then no seam allowance on this outer edge. We're going to cut 2 of this sample. So I'm going to lay it up against the edge so that we already have a 1/2 inch of seam allowance on these edges here. Mark our notch in that outer edge. Now we're going to add our seam allowance. There's just a little bit too much out on this outer edge, so we'll cut that off. Now we are going to flip our pattern and trace it again. Now we are going to trace the pattern for our zipper, because this is what we are attaching our facing to. This is the center back pieces of a blouse. We have those 3 notches to indicate the center back opening of this blouse. We're going to add the seam allowance, because this is the arm's eye that I'm tracing right now and where our facing is going to be attached. If we imagine that we were making a sleeveless blouse, you would need a facing at that arm's eye. Now obviously you're going to flip your pattern and trace it again so you have 2 sides. There we are, 2 sides of a center back. Now we take our facing piece, right sides to right sides, line it up with our arm's eye, and we get to pinning. Now, as this is a curve, we are going to do lots of pins, parallel and perpendicular, basting with our pins along the seam line. I'm going to add 1 more pin here at the edge, just because I know that this type of curve is prone to move on me. And now we're ready for sewing. Now we've orientated our pinning so that the bulk of the fabric is to the left of the machine, and our pins are orientated so that we can pull them out as we're sewing. Now I have sped up the video of this sewing, but you're going to want to take it nice and slow. It's a curve. You're sewing all of this on a 3 stitch length. You're going to back stitch at both ends. We hit our line. Now we are going to grade our seam allowance. And once we're done grading, we are going to clip our seam allowance, because this is an inward curve. Press that stitching, and we can turn our sample so the right sides are out. It's going to want to fight you a little bit. It's going to take a little finagling before it will cooperate. Now I've noticed here that I need to clip some more to get the seam to relax. I have a funny point. So I just go in and I clip down the middle of the seam allowance. And there it lays nicely for me. I'm going to use steam only so that we can finger roll the fabric right up to our seam line. This curve is naturally going to want to fight you, so you're going to have to work harder to get it to lay flat. And once you are satisfied, go ahead and iron. Oh, I noticed that I have a taco, which can happen. That's the fabric moved on me as I was ironing. So I'm going to go back in with my fingers and really work that spot, and then go back and iron it. Now the final step on facing is doing understitching. And understitching is done in order to keep the seam allowance from rolling towards the audience, becoming visible. And so if we go in and we are going to sew the seam allowance down to the facing only, make sure you're sewing to the facing only and not sewing on the center back piece of the garment, because then it would be seen. And we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch into that seam allowance, connecting the seam allowance to the facing. Now, as you have curves going in different directions, it's going to be difficult to do. So I like to use a pin to control my seam allowance to make sure it is under my presser foot, and just go a tiny bit at a time, so making sure you are in control. As you can see, I'm having to fight the fabrics quite a bit here, but as long as I move slow and steady, I am able to control all of that seam allowance, making sure it's tight so that I'm not sewing any bubbles into the costume. So this is sewn on a 3-stitch length as well, with back stitching at the beginning and the end. And you would obviously in general sew this with matching thread so that you would not see this understitching so clearly. And I'm going to back stitch at the end, cutting my threads. And there you can see that understitching is only on the facing. The understitching is not visible from the front side of the garment, and that is how a facing should look.